Hello everyone, and welcome to today's session on research integrity in a rapidly evolving landscape. I'd like to thank our session sponsors, Mauricia, and also my esteemed panel today of experts. So we have Deborah Kahn from COPE, Dr. Sabina Alma from Taylor & Francis, Leslie McIntosh from Digital Science, and Professor Stephen Pinfield from the University of Sheffield. As time is quite tight today, we will have an opportunity for questions at the end of the session, but I would ask you that you keep those questions brief. So we will take questions from the audience and also from our online audience as well. So let's kick off with our first question for our panel. So when we think about research integrity, what are the main challenges and threats to the validity of the scholarly record?
So I think the first thing we have to do with the scholarly record is trust it. And so the biggest question is, can you trust the literature? And can you identify misconduct or fraud or errors easily? And that's true both for editors, for publishers, but also for readers. There's a lot of misconduct about, there's a lot of manipulation to make results look the way that someone might want them to look. And now there are tools, obviously AI, image manipulation tools are much more sophisticated. It's much more difficult to see when people have made changes. So I think the challenge is to make sure that the literature is trustworthy and to identify when it's not. And we need tools, we need education. But I would also say we need to ask whether the way that we present scholarly record, in the same way as we presented it in the first journal in the 17th century, is fit for purpose, and maybe we need to be looking at different ways to present that research so that it's less easy to just create a PDF that looks as if it's a scholarly article.
Sabina?
Thank you. So there are quite a few challenges, obviously. I think we all talk about the reasons behind the issues we're facing today, which is the pressure to publish, but also the need for speed, when we talk about publishers and editors. So I think from both sides, you're getting pressed. So publishing is a currency. You need to publish to get promoted. We all know that, to get funding, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, at the journal end, you have editors and publishers who are really trying to bring down the time frame within which something is handled and peer-reviewed and so on and so forth. So there are real risks involved in maybe dropping standards, dropping due diligence, and that's compounded by a lack of transparency around what goes on behind closed doors, what happens, what went on behind the editorial handling of this, or the peer review process of this. And I think this is where we see the really obvious kind of published papers where there's been some misconduct or manipulation creeping through. Because why did that happen? Why did it ever get published is something we have to face up to, and we have to be honest about, and basically say we all collectively need to do something here. And a big thing that underpins that is the training. We have disconnected training across different stakeholders. And publishers, we say, yes, we do training on publishing ethics and research integrity, and we go to our select bubble and do that. And equally, it's happening at institution level, but it's disconnected. And it becomes really obvious to us when we do, for example, publishing ethics workshops in different institutions across the world. And there's so much misconception around something in my mind, as simple as plagiarism. So there's so much miseducation, so much misinformation about what that is and what that looks like. And now in this day and age, throw in generative AI tools, it's made it even more complicated. So there's a real need, I think, to have a very, very joined up approach towards what standards are, what publishing ethics means, not just research integrity, but publishing ethics, and have a joined up approach towards building better standards collectively.
Definitely. Stephen, from your perspective.
I agree. Lots of challenges. I'd highlight a couple. One is a question of, do we have a shared understanding of what constitutes research integrity? Now, Rachel Bruce has helped us out here by showing us in the earlier session the UKRI statement on integrity, which is associated with the Integrity Concordat, which lists honesty, transparency, accountability, respect, and rigour. Those all sound great, but the devil's in the detail. What do those actually mean? And one interesting question, as scholarly communication becomes more global, is the question, I think, to what extent research integrity, and I think it's important to think about it as part of a bigger research process. Publishing is part of the research process, so we shouldn't think about just publishing integrity, but the research process more generally. But as it becomes more global, we need to ask the question, to what extent are these issues around integrity universal and normative on the one hand, and to what extent are they situated and specific? Now, we're very used to thinking about research integrity as being different across different disciplines. For example, the notion of rigour is different across different disciplines. But what about cultural issues as well, which I think are important? For example, just one example, the notion of authorship, as we have it in the West, is based on a highly individualistic notion. And there are other cultures that have more collectivist kind of mentalities where the notion of authorship is not as clear. So how do we incorporate that into our practical approaches to integrity? And how do we take those kind of cultural differences into account? And I think that's a really big question as we become more globalized. The second thing I'd just like to highlight is, how do we incentivize research integrity? We often focus on a kind of deficit model of catching people when we don't think integrity is in place. But how do we actually positively incentivize it? And recognize, as we're trying to do that there are tensions here. For example, the conventional peer review process looks not just at rigour, but also at novelty and significance. And that can lead to people over-claiming in terms of novelty and significance, for example. The publish or perish imperative is definitely in tension with rigour, perhaps. So we need to recognise this and recognise how we can deal with some of those tensions and also positively incentivise, not just catch people out.
Definitely. Leslie?
Yes, thank you for having me here. Of course, I agree with all of the other panelists and would like to look at this in a bit broader of a sense. So if we think about opening research and think about that being the river of knowledge, and it's rather pure, but some impurities that we think about, where is it moving to? Where is it flowing? And if we think about it flowing into the ocean of knowledge, there is an estuary there with brackish water. How do we trust that water, and how do we trust that what's going on? We can't just think about opening research and opening science without thinking about new filters that we need to have in order to assess and define what research integrity means, not just within the tent of research, but what happens about the ocean of those that consume it. How is research being used outside of research, shall we say, right? Outside of the tent. And how is it potentially being, going on with this metaphor, impurities coming back in, right? Intentionally or unintentionally. So we have to think about a broader context than just those that are conducting the research, those that are here, that are facilitating research communication, but also those that want to consume it for good things, and also those that have more nefarious intentions about them.
Fantastic. So when we think about some of those themes, what can we do to combat the issue of research integrity? And when we think of this current strategies, are they working?
So there's a lot going on, which I'm very pleased to see, because research integrity has always been an issue. It's really only become sort of highlighted over the last 4 or 5 years. Although we've been putting research integrity groups into publishers for the last 10 years or so, but really everybody's recognising the issue, possibly because of the rise of paper mills. One of the very good things that has come out is the STM Integrity Hub. STM has brought together a whole group of publishers to work together to create tools to try and catch some of the issues that might be coming in submitted manuscripts. And Sabina can probably talk more about that because she's involved with that group. But I think one of the things that has become very clear, COPE and STM did a study, Maverick helped us with a study on the problem of paper mills, which we published last year, and it was very clear that one of the recommendations from that is that this has to be a multi-stakeholder effort to deal with some of the integrity problems. It cannot be dealt with by publishers alone or research institutions alone. We have to collaborate. And COPE and STM, as a result of that research, held a summit earlier this year with 40 decision makers from 15 countries representing a whole group of stakeholders, research institutions, research policymakers, publishers, researchers themselves, and various other people to come up with an action plan which we can take forward with to try and deal with some of these issues. And the actions, that will be published quite soon, and the actions are around, as Sabina said, education and awareness, making sure that we have good materials to educate people in research integrity and also to disseminate that educational stuff, to improve post-publications corrections. So when things do get through, we can rapidly change not only the publisher's version, but get that changed across the board, because obviously something which has been published is not only with the publisher, but all over the place. Working with people such as Digital Science and ORCID on their trust markers, which to help those become very clear so you can identify good research, good researchers, and to do some research so that we understand the scale of the problem, because there isn't very much research on this, and then further collaborative projects. So that there will be working groups working on these things. We're hoping to report back at the WCRI meeting next year in June. So there is positive work going on.
Excellent. And so from a publisher perspective, and also from the group that you're currently working with, Sabina, what are your thoughts on this?
So I think one of the most pressing issues that we're facing, when I think about publishers in particular, is the organised fraud that we're just coming up against. It's just so large. They morph and evolve at an alarming rate. And so what's crucial for the publishers is that we have a really reliable information exchange protocol in place. Because it's no good us, at Taylor & Francis, identifying, this is a fake identity of someone or this is a rogue guest editor. We shut it down. They just go somewhere else. We can't do it like that. It has to be centralized. It has to be in a way that is legally responsible as well. We're very aware of all of the legal restrictions around sharing personal data, or at what point do you kind of move over into defamation territory or, witch hunting territory, that kind of thing. It's tricky, but I think we're, again, through the STM organization, STM Solutions in particular, we're kind of trying to sort of working with other publishers and with them and with legal representatives as well to think, how can we actually address this in a centralized way? Because it has to be in that format, in a way that we can share the information quickly, in a scalable way, and most importantly, in an interoperable way. It's no point making it really, really onerous and human-led as well. And I think that would actually help us to stem the bleeding, Because I think for me, one of the most disappointing things that's happened over the last few years, because of how aware we've become of the organized nature of the fraud, it's taken our attention away from the good stuff that's happening, to Stephen's point. But before we used to do a lot more on the awareness and the educational reward systems and this, that, and the other. And it's taken that attention and energy and time away from the good things because we're so focused on the damage that's happening here.
Definitely. And I'm really interested to see from the perspective of the higher education and the researchers.
Yeah, so can I pick up on something Deborah said, which is around the evidence base here? Because as a meta-researcher, it's really frustrating. I want to get hold of data on this to understand the size and shape of the problem, and it's really difficult to obtain data. Now, I do understand this because there's an analogy here, which is, universities being very reluctant to share data on the extent to which they have plagiarism cases among students, for example. So it's a similar kind of thing because it seems to undermine the credibility of degrees, for example, if you say there's all this plagiarism going on, for example. So I do understand the reluctance. But if we can find ways to share data, I come to conferences like this and have loads of conversations, so I understand something through anecdote, the kind of size of the problem. It's always very in hushed voices kind of thing. Can we find ways of sharing data about this so we can understand it? Now, as part of my work, I'm involved in the Research on Research Institute, RORI. And we spent the last 3 or 4 years doing something that I think might be analogous, which is working with funders to share their data on something we call the Funder Data Platform. So we have now multiple funders who are contributing data, which is it's curated in the sense of it's not open data. You have to have permission because it includes things like rejections of funding applications. So it's very, very sensitive personal data. So not everybody can have access to it in open ways, but we can govern access to it in appropriate ways so that then, as long as it's anonymized, analysis can take place on the Funder Data Platform. Could we do something like this around integrity that would respect the privacy and the commercial interests of publishers, but still help us to understand the nature of the problem? That's what I would really like to see happen.
Fantastic. So there's obviously some adaptation that we need to make to our strategy. So Leslie, what are your thoughts on what we can do here?
I think there's a couple of things. I definitely agree with the research, focus on the good, focus on the research integrity. I will say, as somebody who developed a company and a product focused on trying to make research better, it's also very hard to sell because people are very interested in preventing the dodgy stuff rather than supporting the good stuff. I will say, having just returned from Australia, they are, in my opinion, one of the leading nations when it comes to really supporting research integrity. UK is not far behind, in my opinion. I'm just saying that's great. I think the take home from me, who has been a researcher, who's been an entrepreneur, who's now sitting in a different position as VP of Research Integrity, is that we can't give up. It is that societies are absolutely necessary to support research in the community. They are not sufficient, but they are necessary. Peer review has some problems, needs to be strengthened at the scale. It is not sufficient. It is absolutely necessary. Before we give up the things that we see as the search for truth, which is science, right? Not truth itself, but what we do to support the search for truth, let us strengthen what we have and not give that up, because once we start giving those little bits up, those cracks, if you will, then the whole thing can crumble apart. And that's a much bigger view, and I don't mean to be depressing about it or anything, but we have to look beyond just science itself and how science is being looked upon and how it's being trusted or mistrusted or misused. And that's, again, not to give up. Support your societies, support peer review, support the things that are good and strengthen those.
Fantastic. So if we think about the one thing that you would like to see change, what would that be at the moment?
I think, as Stephen said, as I said originally, more understanding of what the problem is. I think we do need to do that research. We do need to really highlight where the problems are and focus on those. There's a lot of talk. I'd like to see things move faster as well. I think we've all got our day jobs, everyone's sort of focused on a particular thing that they're doing, and we need to work together and move faster on all of this.
Fantastic. Sabina?
Well, if I had all the power to change everything, one of the things I would change is actually make the publishing process more transparent in terms of the decision process, and disentangle it from whether it got published or not, or whether it got published in a massive journal or a tiny journal. Just the fact this was a research outcome and it was assessed. This is who assessed it, or even if you can't say who assessed it, because I understand open signing peer review reports can lead to other types of problems, to at least showcase the reports that supported or didn't support the publication of it. But I think really opening it up, there's so much information behind closed doors that shouldn't be, quite frankly, because I think the publication of research is for everyone, and for everyone to also assess as well. So, and I know that that's not an idea that's well loved by everyone, but it's the one thing I think would really help all stakeholders remain accountable for what goes through their hands, and actually feeding through to the data as well. Like, it really would open it up. And I'd like to see that change.
Definitely. Stephen, I assume it's about...
I was going to go for transparency, but Sabina's bagged that, so I'll talk about something else, which I think is really important, and that is that we, around the bigger picture, that we see integrity in terms of different actors and different layers. We often think about it in terms of, in scholarly communication, the author. But what about the integrity of the reviewer? For example, how do we ensure that there is reviewer integrity when we know there is distrust amongst authors that their work is not being handled fairly, or amongst grant proposers that their grant bids are not being handled fairly? How do we ensure integrity of the reviewer, for example, and not just focus on the author? And there are other, thinking about it in terms of layers, not just individuals, but groups, communities. How do we ensure integrity is built into research groups? Not that every individual is responsible for it, just because they are, but actually as a group. How do we ensure groups build in integrity in the way that they behave, for example, and communities? And then, kind of at the systemic level, how do we ensure that we can recognise and monitor and measure integrity? So that kind of individual, group and systemic levels are really important. We shouldn't just focus on individual parts of that.
Definitely. Leslie?
So building on from the open and transparent, while I completely agree, I would say if you do that, also what are the checks and the filters that you're going to have as you open that process? Because again, that is a susceptibility outside of science that we need to be very careful about, or that can be manipulated. I would also add on to the peer review, how about the editors? What are their responsibilities? The consumers, what are their responsibilities? And I would say, of all of the data that I've analyzed, and it's over 33 million, papers and not 33 million journals, we're not there yet, thankfully. I have yet to find a publisher that doesn't have a dodgy editor or some other issue, right? Is that the publisher's fault, or is that person who is manipulating the system, right? We need to have strength in who we are and stand up to that and push back, play an offensive game rather than just a defensive game, to make sure that we are the powerful and the strong and doing the best, because that's ethical. Ethical's not research integrity is not being right all the time, right? It's actually owning up and being truthful and being integral, being whole. And that's where we need to be, even with those mistakes that happen sometimes.
Definitely. And we'd like to open this out to the audience now. So if you have any questions.
We've got two ways to ask a question, either on the app or live here in the audience. So let's go, first of all, let's keep it short as well.
Thanks very much, Henry from BMJ. Really, really interesting discussion. This is such a passion of mine, really, research integrity. I just wanted to picking up on a couple of points. How do we as publishers, but also the wider research community, maintain that high quality peer review and rigorous editorial processes to ensure that what we're publishing is ethically sound and valid. Given that there is a growing volume, a rapidly growing volume all the time, we've got journals publishing hundreds of thousands of papers a year, and yet there's pressures to reduce time to publication, as well as speed up all aspects of the process.
Who'd like to take that one?
Well, I'm happy to start. There are now, I think there's a lot of talk about AI and how AI is a threat, but it's also an opportunity. So I think using tools appropriately in the whole publishing process will help us. I think, as was just talked about, really good training of editors and reviewers and authors across the board will help. But also, I think maybe we don't need the speed that we have been, we have been pushing and pushing and pushing for faster peer review and faster publication, when sometimes it's dependent on people who just don't have that time. So maybe we need to relax that a bit. But finally, I would go back to the thing I said right at the beginning, which is maybe we need to look at the research paper and look at, and this will take longer, but look at the way we craft our outputs and that researchers craft their outputs, so that we're not doing the whole thing at once, that we are creating points within the process where someone publishes a protocol, someone publishes the methods, someone publishes their data and a discussion, and they're all at different times, and that they require different types of review, and that will make a very different process happen. And I think that's well overdue, and we need to start talking about that.
I'll just add as well that we sort of tend to talk about peer review like it can only ever be one thing, one type of thing, and it has to look like this to be peer review, right? And I think even in this day and age where our research articles and so on are the way they are, what we don't do enough of is kind of break down what are the points that need to be checked before it's even gone to a reviewer. And actually we have to, I think for publishers as well, that we have to support our editors and reviewers in that by actually having some resources to do some of those basic level checks before it lands in their inbox. They shouldn't be having to pick up a paper that is littered with problems. So they can just focus on the key things that we want them to focus on, which is from their expert opinion, what do they think? I used to see this on one of the journals that I ran for a while, because it was a highly selective journal. We had a really high acceptance rates of peer reviewers, but there was also a lot of work that went on in the team before it ever got to them. So what they got was a nicely kind of presented and well-read, paper. I think in this day and age as well, with all the issues that we're facing with manipulation and so on, editors say this to us quite frequently, is how can you expect us to be detectives? We have no time to do this, and all the resources, all the knowledge. So I think there's something that we have to do collectively to sort of see it as step one, submission comes in, it goes through XYZ types of checks. If it passes these types of checks, then it can go to the editor to think of if it's in scope, et cetera, for their journal, and then to the peer reviewer if it passes those steps. So you're kind of triaging more and more. And I'm well aware some journals which are really well resourced will be doing that as we speak. They're already doing that, but actually we need that to happen across the board.
We got a question on the newfangled app that I think should go to digital science. What do publishers need to do differently at a strategic level to address the rise of systematic fraud? Are there new capabilities we need, and where do we need to invest?
So, I don't think I'll answer the last one without being very biased. I'm going to echo that we have to automate what we can so that we can focus on what we need to from the human perspective. It is computer-augmented human decision-making that we need to do. And what do we need to do better? We need to figure out what to do with all of the crap that's out there, and how to address that. It will still be coming in, but we have to address that. I think if we think about this in the way that art fraud, I love art, and if art fraud has progressed, the way in which you could get away with fraud earlier has changed over time. Why has it changed over time? Because people figure out, that paint wasn't invented in that year, and so that couldn't necessarily be from that artist. We are going to have that in the system. This is never going to go away. And so we have to stay on our toes about figuring out what are the areas that we need to trust. And I almost think, this gets back into how are you going to do it more from a company standpoint, but I almost think we have to have a group dedicated to the what to do with all the dodgy stuff that's already out there, and how do you support all of the good stuff and good researchers and make sure that they are known simultaneously. And I wouldn't say it has to be two groups, but on the other hand, it all ends up becoming focused on the dodgy stuff rather than focused on the good stuff as well. And I have some tools to recommend for anyone, but I'll talk later on that.
There's two things we promised ourselves we wouldn't talk about. First is paper mills, and the second is ChatGPT. But I'm a huge fan of ChatGPT, so how can we use it in a integrity-based way?
It comes back to transparent and responsible use, right? So I think in the beginning of the year, when we're all going, what do? We need to come up with policies about large language models or any kind of generative AI tools, really. We focused on the fact that we can't ban a tool, right? We can't ban something we can't detect. Also, who are we to tell researchers how they're going to use these tools? They may find all kinds of great ways to use it, but we need to know how they're using it in relation to the work that they're presenting and the papers. So that's what we focused on. But then at the same time, of course, we're concerned about when it gets sent to a peer review and the peer reviewer goes, oh, I want to use this to write my report because it's going to help me, and it's generated a nonsense report, is misuse. So I think there's, I don't think we're there yet. We need consensus about governance, regulation around the use of this, how it applies to publishing ethics, as well as research integrity.
And how do you see that from your perspective, Stephen? Are you seeing a proliferation of your researchers using these new AI tools?
Once again, it's difficult to know exactly. To be honest, in my role, I've come across it more in relation to universities wrestling with this in relation to students' work, but it's a similar kind of situation. Yeah. When ChatGPT was quite new, I put in several of my essay questions into ChatGPT to see what it produced, and it would have passed. What came back would have passed. And I was extremely worried about that because you just don't know how people are using it. They could, some students could say, well, I'm writing something, I'm putting it into ChatGPT and seeing so it can improve my language, for example. And there are lots of grammar help tools out there. If you use, is that okay? Is that okay for a journal author? That kind of thing becomes very grey. So universities are now looking at all sorts of ways in which they can both use it positively, so see what it produces and get students to critique the response, for example, as a way of really interacting with it in a positive way. But also maybe another solution would be, let's go back to exams in invigilated conditions so that people can't produce essays. So there are a whole bunch of different responses, and I suspect in the publishing field there'll be a whole bunch of both kind of sanction-based and also kind of encouraging, but in particular ways type responses. But it's a major... I don't think anybody's got any easy answers at the moment, have they? I'd be interested to know.
So I think similar to what you were saying about essays and, sort of being able to critique an essay, a research paper should have some novelty. It should be an interesting question. It should be something that someone hasn't been working on before. It should be something that has taken a while. So I don't think we can stop people using ChatGPT or other AI tools. I think they are important and useful, and they are going to be in use. But we want the research that we publish to actually have some value. And a tool can't do that. They can't do the research. So I think it's exactly as Leslie said, it's augmenting human research rather than doing it for you. It's not doing the research. And I think we get carried away with worrying about that, and I think it makes us look for more novelty, more interesting research, which is important.
And I think this is where that linked up sort of training and education becomes important
definitely.
again, because when we talk to our colleagues who know about this stuff, you know, when they explain how the tool works, then we go, well, actually, other users of this tool, do they know how it works? The fact that it's just assimilating, there can be hallucinations in there. You can, so if you have to understand how this tool works, any researcher in a lab has to understand how this equipment works to generate this result, and it's the same for this type of thing.
All comes back to training.
All comes back to training and education, yeah.
Hello. If I may, I would like to ask you for a guesstimate on how big you see the problem is. I mean, what would you, and again, a guesstimate, if I may, is the percentage of the current literature that you consider to be beyond the integrity threshold?
It's impossible to tell you because there isn't the evidence.
So there might be not a problem at all, you're saying? There might be not a problem at all.
No, there is a problem. There's certainly a problem, but trying to, you know, some people are saying 50% of the literature, that's wrong. I mean, there's someone out there who is going around talking about, he's done some research, and his research is based on the fact that authors don't have institutional addresses and may not speak English. And then he says all of those things are not proper articles. Well, that's not true. We can do research on what has been found in the literature, and the Maverick report that Cope and STM created tried to look at experiences from publishers that publishers were willing to share, and we have got some numbers in there, but they vary enormously, and it's only the stuff that's so far been found, and we haven't found everything. So I think the estimates in that report are somewhere between 5 and 20%, but we don't know, and we do need to do the research.
If I could just add to that, one of the things that we've looked at is nefarious networks, so citation cartels, and actually took some of a specific type, I will say, and then analyzed it over how many articles did we see in different journals with this dodgy behavior, and it was about 1 to 3%, just to put a number on that. Now, we're not saying anything about the quality of the research going on. That's not what we're speaking about there, and so it is a very small percent, but that's a significant impact, although it's a small percent.
Yeah.
The other thing, though, I just want to bring up is we accidentally got articles from the 1950s and 60s when we were training the algorithm, one of our algorithms, and it kept coming up on, we were looking at corrections, and I didn't realize how prevalent it was to go, oh, by the way, I got this wrong, and I'm just, here's the right one, and it just would come in. Well, was their original article supposed to be retracted, or is this a correction? I mean, it seemed to be, this is how science works, and I forgot to write down, I put in the wrong chemical, type of thing. It was a good little history lesson of where we were and how we used to communicate.
Can I just add to that many of the lists of what constitutes research integrity kind of hint at this, but I don't think they say it directly, and that is the importance of humility. Recognition that what I'm saying is not complete and may well be wrong, and actually being open to being corrected, and finding corrections and being open about sharing those is really important. I think we do need to promote humility in science.
And do you think there's...
Sorry. And I just wanted to add to that, but I think the other side to that is the consequences.
Yes.
And I think so. That's the other thing that we need to address is because actually the consequences for having a retracted article are quite serious to some people, and I think sometimes that's what pushes up against someone. They may want to actually say, I want to correct this, but they're worried about what would happen. And so there's some other discussions, we've been trying to have around also, we talk about retractions like they're one thing. So we've retracted because of misconduct versus an error, but we're using the same terminology.
Yeah.
And that's something we also need to kind of separate out.
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing to that, which is slightly away from Baz's question, but it's one of the things we have to do is not make it a bad thing for publishers to retract a lot of articles, because publishers have been punished for correcting the literature, and that's not right. They're doing the right thing. If they find stuff that's wrong, historically wrong, they need to be celebrated for that rather than punished for that. But that's not what's happening. And so if we want the literature corrected, if we want to know that it's right, we need to give publishers the ability to feel good about making these changes and be rewarded for what's right, doing what's right, rather than the other way around.
Time is fleeting.
Hi, Robin Mugridge from Frontiers. Is there a risk that by being open around trust markers and the things that we're looking for around quality, that we are giving information to those nefarious networks, those bad actors, that in turn perpetuates the problem by telling them what we're looking for?
Yes. One of the conferences that I will be attending is the American Research Integrity Officers Conference, and they actually have a closed session and decided not to keep it completely open so that they could speak amongst themselves about what's going on and some of the issues. And while I would love to be in the room, I completely respect their decision. And as someone who believes in open science, even if I believe that there needs to be filters and checks, I struggle with that. But I think we have to be very careful about everything that we open.
Yeah.
And appropriately enough, we're going to go to our session sponsor.
Oh, very good. Yeah, thank you. So, Sami from Movis here. And obviously a question around technology. Maybe just an observation to say that technology hasn't been adapted in a very fast way in our industry over the past decennies, I would say. At least that's my feeling. How can we give guidance or sort of support to publisher or to the players in the ecosystem to adapt these new technologies that are evidently also supporting, to at least support parts of solving the problem? How can we give guidance on adapting these technologies a little bit faster this time around?
I think people have to be willing to make mistakes. You have to be willing to try it. There are some people doing really well in this area and who are using technology to do some peer review checks, pre-peer review, if you will, right? Not the science, but checking on that. It needs to be affordable, and honestly, it would be nice to have more investment in this, and that would take money into this area.
All right, well, it just remains for me to say thank you very much to all of our panelists, to the wonderful Becky Mokes for putting this together, and to all of you for coming along and making this such a great discussion. I've really learned a lot. The panelists have told me that they're going to be around. If you want to chat to them, now's your chance. It's not often we get such a great panel of experts in this topic together in one place. So thank you, everybody, once again for joining us. And have a great rest of the day. Let me just say there's going to be a 5-minute break so that we can switch rooms. And the next session in this room will be the scintillatingly sounded Making Open Access Monographs Work, Moving from Vision to Implementation. So thank you so much, everybody.